Several weeks ago, I had a spirited and insightful debate with a freelance writer of 10 plus years who frequently writes reviews for IGN. Over the course of our debate, a number of interesting points were made, and I've spent much of the last few weeks thinking about what was said. But at the heart of what we discussed was the nature of being a critic or reviewer. In this case, we use the terms interchangeably, though to many people they are different things. And admittedly, I've always subscribed to Joseph Anderson's description of their differences. Namely, that a review is answering the question, is this worth your time and/or money, while a critique is asking, did this thing achieve its goals and/or succeed at being what the developers intended it to be? The idea is that in simple terms, a review treats a game like a product, whereas a critique treats it as art. Now let me be clear, I know that by these definitions, many reviews heavily overlap into critique and vice versa. I'm laying out these differences because I believe that by defining them clearly, I can establish for you, the viewer, the motivation behind my making content. For those watching, I want you to know that I say this with the utmost respect, but I believe that a review is written for consumers, and frankly, I couldn't care less about reaching consumers. That's not to say I don't appreciate and want an audience of informed gamers who share my opinions, but that's not who I make content for, so to speak. The ultimate goal of my content is to deliver a commentary on the games I love and where I think they succeed to the people who actually make them. I want to deliver my feedback in the form of a critique coming from an informed player and fan. Someone on the outside looking in who maintains a healthy distance from, but rudimentary understanding of game development. I don't think a developer would make for the best critic because when you've been on the other side, it fundamentally shifts how you perceive things. Speaking for myself, the process of making content has opened my eyes to the experiences of other content creators in a way that makes it hard to deliver the kind of feedback I would want from my own audience. However, the average player is a mouth-breathing moron, not you guys are cool. And so meaningful developer feedback delivered via respectful critique from informed players is basically non-existent. And that's what I'm trying to change. Part 1. Nuance. Now much has been said about nuance in the discussion of games criticism and content creation over the years, but let's talk about what that means. I don't want to provide a dictionary definition of nuance because I think that part of being able to explain something is being able to accurately define it in your own terms. So then, nuance is for all intents and purposes the gray area in any statement or belief. To respect nuance is to acknowledge through a more deliberate and considerate choice of our words that how we say things matters just as much as what we mean when we say them. Nuance is not conceding to another person, but rather making a concerted effort to recognize the space for reasonable disagreement within our own arguments. But how do we express nuance exactly? Well, as I alluded to, we simply need to choose our words more carefully. However, not all circumstances and situations call for a careful choice of words, I'm more than aware of that. And naturally, that means that not all things are nuanced. For example, there is no nuance needed when saying Dr. Disrespect is a disgusting piece of shit, because there's no gray area, it's just an incontrovertible fact. Hopefully that paints a clear enough picture of what nuance is, but before I get to the rest of the video, we also need to talk about one other thing. Part 2. Subjectivity. Now, I'm not going to define subjectivity either, because if you don't know what it is and you've made it this far, I'm going to assume you've fallen asleep. What I actually want to get at is a sentiment shared by the majority of critics, including the aforementioned IGN writer and Joseph Anderson. The idea that subjectivity is implied. To once again be perfectly clear, I wholeheartedly agree with this statement. However, I feel that it's often used as an invalid defense of a critic's opinion and/or perspective. Subjectivity being implied means that you do not need to preface every statement with, in my opinion, as it's understood that any critic is fundamentally sharing their opinion. That's all fine and good, however now we need to circle back around to nuance on the point of this section. I posit, fancy word right, that subjectivity being implied is often used in bad faith to deny the call for nuance in critique and review. This is something that I discussed at length with our IGN writer and one of the only points I was still grappling with at the end of our friendly debate. So having said that, I've thought about this particular point quite a lot in recent weeks, and this is the example I've come up with to explain it. If you say to me, the combat and movement mechanics in Suicide Squad are bad and poorly designed, I'm going to say you're wrong. Not that I disagree, not that we have different opinions, but that you are wrong. Now you see, saying something is poorly designed is fundamentally different from saying it wasn't fun for you, that you didn't like it, or that it negatively impacted your time with it. These are statements a person playing a game is more than qualified to make because they are descriptions of their own personal experience which no one can argue with. However, if you are going to make claims about the quality of someone's work rather than just how you felt about it, you damn well better be a professional capable of expressing to your colleague exactly what is wrong with their approach and the explicit steps they can take to make it better. Now what I have often heard in response to that is, say it with me now, subjectivity is implied. And that's true, subjectivity is implied. But nuance is not, because as mentioned earlier, nuance is fundamentally about the words we choose, not something that can be implied. Implication and assumption are essentially the antithesis of nuance. And by extension, you cannot use the implied subjectivity of critique as a shield against criticism for using language that is explicitly objective and/or inherently lacking in nuance. To illustrate this point, I'll use myself in my content. As a viewer, I genuinely value your feedback to make my content better. And if you don't like how I've done something, then I encourage you to respectfully express what you don't like, especially in the comments down below. But if you say, I didn't like your most recent video, the tone and subject just didn't work for me, I'm going to thank you for being upfront about that and take it into consideration going forward. On the contrary, if you come to me and say, your last video was poorly written and your editing was bad, can you guess what I'm going to say? Okay, well, damn. I mean, I'm probably going to agree a little bit, but unless I have reason to believe you are a skilled writer or video editor, I'm also going to tell you to go fuck yourself. After all, why would I care what you have to say about the quality of my work if you aren't familiar with the process of making it? And before anyone says anything, yeah, if an experienced writer and video editor said my work was shit, then at the very least I'd take that seriously and ask for whatever advice they can offer to make it less so. My point being, do you care when someone who sucks at games or doesn't play them says you're bad at a game? Exactly. Alright, so then what is the point of all this? Well, when I was tossing around the ideas I had for this script, I decided to simply Google review versus critique and see what came up. The first thing I found and the inspiration for this video's title was The Critic Dilemma, Criticism versus Review by a musician named David Liebman. While the article is clearly motivated by similar questions as this video, I didn't really agree with his conclusions, but if you're curious, I'll have a link in the description for anyone who'd like to read it. Anyway, if you've been paying attention to the state of the video game industry and the discourse that surrounds it, then you've no doubt seen just how divisive and toxic the conversation around games has become. And I believe that this is the result of what I'm calling the Game Critic's Dilemma. If you're anything like me, you at some point or another have probably felt that popular gaming outlets such as IGN give out way too many 7s, and that in general the lower half of the review scale is underutilized. In fact, let me tell you a little story about that as an aside. When I first set out to make content just over a year ago, I believed that I was stepping into a discussion that is too forgiving of games and their flaws. I thought that reviewers were not being harsh enough, and that in spite of some exceptions, games as a whole were largely getting worse. Now, anyone familiar with my other videos and how I talk about games nowadays may be shocked to hear that. After all, the most common thing I hear from haters and detractors is that I'm either a shill, a contrarian, or both. But do you want to know the difference between then and now? I just play way more games than I used to. That's it. The thing that made me want to talk about games differently was I sat down and I watched, and I'm a huge fan of Never Knows Best, and I watched all of his videos, and I don't know, God knows how many months back, he came out with a video that was about bad games, quote unquote, right? And for all intents and purposes, it was a defense of bad games. And the one point that just really connected with me, the one thing that just, again, when I think about talking about games, I think about talking to the people that make them. And I imagine them sitting across from me. And the thing that just fucking hit me like a truck was when he said, no one sets out to make something bad. No one sets out to make something that you don't like, that you're unhappy with, that you didn't have a good time with. And I just, as someone who's started making things, it just hit me over the fucking head. That's the kind of understanding of something you just can't have if you haven't made something. And then when you make something and you hear something like that and you go, no fucking shit, of course not. Of fucking course not. The people that make my games are doing their absolute fucking best because they're creative people trying their absolute fucking hardest. And like, I can give them all the criticism that they want if they want to sit down and talk to me and ask them for tips or tricks or whatever things I think could be better, right? But in the meantime, given all that they have to deal with online and everything, I just see there's no value in that. There's no virtue in that. Why would I bother with that when I can tell them that they've done a good job and that like what they do matters? Whether you want to believe it or not, the number of great games released every year is so high that it's basically impossible to experience all of them, even for those of us who are trying to play games for work. Standards haven't gotten lower, games just keep getting better. But you wouldn't know that unless, like me, you've played dozens of games this year alone. There was a time when you could finish the latest major release, and it would be weeks or even months until another great game came out. And if a game you had high expectations for came out and wasn't very good, the sting of that disappointment was far worse. Believe me, I remember. In the past month alone, there have been 4 major releases, each from different genres. and I have seen many people make sincere arguments for why each could be a Game of the Year contender. What I'm getting at is that the very nature of review is constantly shifting and being questioned. In a world where games just keep getting better, do we adjust our expectations and our personal review scales accordingly? Do we measure games by their own individual merits, or do we measure them against their contemporaries? Do we measure them based on the experiences we had, or the quality of what we can see within them? Do we write a review for the player or for the developer? Do we have a responsibility to express ourselves with nuance? I think those questions lie at the heart of the game critic's dilemma, because those are the questions we have to ask ourselves as critics, and our answers fundamentally shape our personal understanding of what it means to review products or critique art. I don't think a fellow critic is right or wrong for answering them differently than I will, even though part of me may want to say otherwise. The reality is that so long as we do our best to acknowledge our own biases, deliver our opinions with nuance, and treat developers with respect, then we're ultimately on the same side. Now, unfortunately, many outlets do insist on giving review scores when I personally believe a score is somewhat antithetical to nuance. It's a way of trying to summarize or condense all your thoughts on the game or its merits into a single number. Don't get me wrong, I don't begrudge reviewers for having to give scores. In fact, I feel bad for them because those scores are constantly used to misconstrue or outright lie about a writer's feelings on a game. Scores kill nuance, and to a population of consumers who shudder at the very suggestion that it exists, they're a flawed means of expression that often gets bent into nonsensical gotcha arguments. As a content creator not beholden to any kind of editorial process or procedure bar my own, I don't have to give scores and pretty much never do. I know that review scores are a great tool for informing responsible people with critical thinking skills, but more often than not, they are weaponized against developers and critics alike by people who will skip to the score and ignore the review entirely. And even worse than traditional review scores are aggregate scores provided by the likes of Metacritic and OpenCritic. Again, these tools provide legitimately valuable information, but when used by the average person as barometers for a game's quality, they've basically taken nuance out back and given those people a gun to shoot it with. I don't really know what I wanted this video to say or be about, if I'm honest. I don't even know if this is all that I want to say or how I want to say it. But I guess the point I'm trying to make with it all is that being a sincere critic isn't as easy as it may seem, and it's certainly more challenging than I was ever prepared for it to be. That's by no means a complaint, as I welcome the challenge and cherish the opportunity to develop a deeper understanding of the art that has informed so much of my life and who I am. I do have my own answers to the questions posed by the game critic's dilemma, and I'd be willing to bet my answers will continue to grow and change just as they likely do for anyone trying to preach nuance these days. I suppose if there's one thing I hope you take away from this video, it's that the context and nuance of what a person has to say is completely lost when we take scores at face value or try to treat reviews and critiques like debates. So next time you watch or read a review of a game, I challenge you to get to the end and guess what the score is before checking. You might just be surprised at what you find. Unless it's one of mine, because as everyone knows, I'm the #1 woke DEI gamer and a massive shill. I think about the talk I had with Jada about the developer's spouse who came in during their final grind with Concord, and he literally just came in to ask someone who seemed like they were enjoying it what they liked about it, because he just wanted to share with his partner, wife, or husband, I don't know, either or, whichever, whatever. He just wanted to share with his partner that, like, some positivity, because they were just distraught. They just didn't know why this thing that they worked so hard on was just such a failure, and that just fucking breaks my heart. Like, that's why I do it, because I want to be able to give that person an answer. And I think that's why that game pisses me off so much, and why I'm so fucking mad about it still, is because I don't have an answer for it, and that kills me. That kills me that I can't tell that person what they could do better. They worked so hard. They did such a good job. I had so much fun, and I don't know how to tell that person anything that could have changed the course of things. Like, that just seems like it. I feel like that, if anything, is my job, and I'm failing to do my job by not being able to give that person an answer. Like, God, it kills me. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, then don't forget to like, subscribe, and ding the little bell to be notified when my next one goes live. If you'd like to support the channel, you can donate down below or become a member for just a few dollars a month. Thanks again, and see you next time.